What is up, everybody? This is All Things Entertaining here, bringing you with another episode of Blast from the Past. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Billy Break's first place YCS Toronto Tengu plant deck, all the way back from September 2011. And this one actually came out a bit of a shock, considering the fact that at this time, the September 1st ban list had just neutered the plant engine as a whole, as well as completely destroyed some of the synchro monsters that were key players in it by putting those cards to 1. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the deck itself, as well as what the overall goal of the deck was, as well as what some of the cards do, and some of the interesting tech choices for that time period, as 2011, believe it or not, was 9 years ago. This deck is basically 10 years old, actually, at this point now. It might as well be 10 years old. So without any further ado, let's just jump into the deck list itself. And some of you might be looking at some of these cards like, what the heck do these these X's mean? I'll get into that, what they mean in a minute when we get there. Spoiler alert, they're pre-erratas, so we're going to be working with cards that are the pre-errated versions, as the newer versions don't really make it that much sense. Anyway, on to the deck list. So the first card that we have here is quite stunning, is Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning. You know, that card that is kind of an okay card. It doesn't really see much play nowadays, but it was actually a powerhouse of a card. This card used to be banned, and then actually as of September 1st, 2011, this card was put to limited status, and everyone thought Konami was actually crazy. People thought this card was way too good for what it was, and it was a mistake on Konami's part, and people actually assumed that this card would get rebanned on the following list, but that never really happened. I'm pretty sure a lot of you already understand what this card does. You probably already understand what most of these cards do, but just in case of those who are new to this and don't really know who BLS is, it cannot be a normal summon set, and it must be special summoned from your hand by banishing 1 light and 1 dark from your graveyard. Once per turn, you can activate one of the following effects. You can target a monster on the field and banish it. This card cannot attack the turn this card is activated. If this card attacks and destroys an opponent's monster by battle, it can make a second attack in a row. So this card was just a powerhouse of a card. It did a lot of things, and it did a lot of things well. It was monster removal, which was pretty good. It banished, even though it targeted back then, that wasn't really that big of an issue. Back then, you didn't really have cards that were immune to targeting and all that sort of thing. But it was supremely good for this card to, just banish a monster. Also, it could also be played pretty aggressively as well as a control card. So if you destroyed an opponent's monster, and you could attack again, it was that good. So an interesting notion to add there. Another good thing here is Gore's Emissary of Darkness. Now, this card was at 1, believe it or not. This card was pretty much a scary card. You guys might hear the jokes that people play around Gore's by attacking with the lowest with the lowest attack monster, but that was a serious line of play back in the day, because people were so afraid of this one-of. It was crazy. What it would do is if you dealt battle damage to it and your opponent had no monsters on or no cards on the field, you would summon this card, and then you would get an additional level 7 token with the attack of the monster that dealt damage. So, for example, let's say we just use Thunder King Ryo here as an example. You would attack with the Thunder King Ryo. It would deal 1900 damage, but then you would summon the Gores, and then you would get a 1900 token on top of it. It was super good back then. Nowadays, it's kind of a lackluster, slow hand trap. It's kind of funny to see how much we've progressed through at this time in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think it's kind of funny, actually. So yeah. Next card is Kaius, the Shadow Monarch. For those of you who are heavy Monarch fans, you might actually recognize this card in your structure decks as a cool looking monster and nothing really much to it. But back then, again, much like BLS, this card was an absolute monster. People were actually really afraid of this card because it just targeted a monster and just straight up banished it. It actually was more flexible in some cases than BLS, because BLS could only target monsters, whereas this card could target any card on the field if it wanted to. And if that card happened to be a dark monster, which was quite often during this time period because you were playing a lot of Chaos variants because BLS just came off the ban list, you would just deal 1000 damage. Also, it was pretty good for countering stuff like Gore's and Tragodia, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Well, actually, we're not going to talk about Tragodia in this one because it's actually not in this list. But Tragodia was another card that was actually pretty feared back in the day. But on to the Thunder King Ryos. This was the original mistake, not like a literal mistake. This card was actually pretty good back in the day. This card had the same effect as Mistake, where neither player could add cards from their deck to their hand except by drawing them, and it had an additional effect where if your opponent would summon a monster, you could send this card to the graveyard and negate the special summon, and then destroy it. It was pretty good. It was an effective monster. It was also 1900 attack, and it was a light monster which fielded perfectly for the BLS that was waiting in the wings. Next is three copies of Reborn Tengu. Back in the old days, in 2011, there was this thing where we actually had the same ban list, the OCG and the TCG. We pretty much shared anything that they did, and we shared whatever they wanted to do. So if they wanted to limit certain cards, we kind of just had to take it on the chin and say, well, I guess that's what it is. Back in the day, this card was a TCG exclusive, and during this time frame, the OCG didn't really recognize TCG exclusives as a part of their game, so they pretty much ignored it for the most part. And it wasn't to be until I think 2012 that this card would actually be semi-limited, because it was so powerful. But this card, if it was sent to the graveyard or if it leaves the field in any capacity, you just straight up summon another one. That was super good because having a monster that recurred itself after synchro summoning or whatever you wanted to do with it, after that it was pretty. You just summon another one. It was pretty good if you're facing against a bunch of people who are playing Kaiuses and BLSs, because if they banished it, well, you got another copy of it and they would have to deal with it. It was pretty good back in the day. It's not so good now. There are far better cards than this, but this card was actually pretty much a relevant consistency card that was a nice combo piece for a lot of players. Next, we have Debris Dragon. As of the 2011, not 2001, the game wasn't even out yet. Debris Dragon was originally semi-limited and then re-limited on this list. Because Debris Dragon, when it was normal summon, it would just target a monster that had 500 attack or less and summon it. That was a lot of your cards. There was a lot of tuners back in the day that you wanted to summon with this. You think Crystron Needle Fiber was pretty good? This card was way better during this time, in my opinion. Because you had so many more targets. You can bring back the Lone Fire Blossom, which was at 1 at this point. It was actually limited. And it used to be semi-limited, but it was limited. We had the Dandelion, which was still legal at this time. It wasn't at 1. Spirit Reaper, which just came off the list to 3 copies per deck. This card was actually feared, by the way. Maxis, if you really needed the extra monster, which did happen sometimes, believe it or not. And also, Maxi was not as powerful as it used to be. Spore was a pretty good tuner. You would activate Debris Dragon and then summon Spore, and you wouldn't use its effect, so you can make something like Formula Synchron, which was pretty nice. Gold Bulb, again, same kind of dealio as Spore. Your effect failures were also at 500 attack or less, so you just had a lot of targets for this card to be really effective for what it did. And we play the 3 Torghast and the 1 Sangan. Before Photon Shockwave, there was a ruling that you could do with Sangan that if you were to send Sangan as a material for an Xyz monster, it would consider being sent from the field to the graveyard. I don't understand how that worked out. I don't understand how the TCG came to that conclusion that was an okay ruling, but they did. And this, for a good couple of months after the Xyz era was just beginning, this was a common thing that you would do with Sangan. In Torghast, you would just normal summon the Torghast to get the Sangan, make a rank 3, detach the material for it, and then you would get a free search on top of whatever effect the rank 3 had, which at this stage would just been Leviair or Leviathan Dragon, but you had stuff like Granosaurus, which was also another popular rank 3 back in the day, because we didn't have that many rank 3s. But it was a very powerful way of getting cards, as well as getting more presence with the monsters that you were already summoning. So it was just a really good thing. And you got some pretty good stuff. You got the Maxis and the Effect Failures, which were the premium hand traps of the time. You also got the Gores. You also had stuff like Tragodia, but this one wasn't played. Tragodia wasn't played as much in the following years, but it was super good. Next, we have some pretty good spell cards here. Some of you might recognize these spell cards, some of you might not. We got the 1 for 1 Heavy Storm, the 1 Mind Control, 1 Dark Hole, 1 Pot Avarice, 1 Foolish Burial, 2 Mystical Space Typhoon, 1 Book of Moon, 1 Scapegoat, and 2 Enemy Controller. Mind Control has always been a problem in the game. I'm pretty sure a lot of you were kind of wondering why Mind Control may have been put back to 1. It might not seem as powerful as it is today, but back then, taking a resource from your opponent was actually something that was to be feared. Even if it was just for a turn, even if you couldn't do really much anything with the card itself, you could still synchro summon and exceed summon with it. It was super reliable. That's kind of the same line of reasoning for enemy controller, but you could play enemy controller as a defensive card as well. And it was really good in that sense as well. Scapegoat obviously was really good because it was an easy way to make your Formula Sync run, which I believe was just limited on this list. Yes, it was. Just looking back at here, because I actually had the PDF pulled up. I'll have the link if you want to look at the list down below. It's actually kind of a different time. You can kind of, it's like a time capsule. But Heavy Storm was a legal card. On this list, Giant Trunade actually just got banned, and Harvey Feathers Duster was still considered a really broken card. And this card is broken, don't get me wrong, but it was kind of seen as a little bit fair because a lot of people were playing a little bit more defensive. So it was okay. It was a pretty good card. You got your stuff like your Pot Avarices, Dark Hole. I think actually Dark Hole came to 1 on this list. Oh no, Dark Hole would have been limited for a little bit off this list too. But this was another card that people were really up in arms about when it came off the list. Like, Dark Hole was actually crazy. And now it's at 3 copies per deck and nobody plays it. It's kind of funny how that works out. And Foolish Burial is Foolish Burial. Don't really need to talk about it. Interestingly, many of you guys might not know this, but Mystical Space Typhoon was actually limited at one point. The reason why it was that way was because people, Konami had this really big fear of removal getting too out of hand. But it didn't really make much sense because they kept really powerful cards like Heavy Storm in the game, and they put this card to 1 arbitrarily. Actually, another really interesting note, Destinator was actually put to 2 at some point, which is actually in this list as another means of spell and trap removal. But Destinator was put at 1 at 2, and I think it was put at 1 at some point, but I'm not actually confident I'm remembering that correctly. But it was put at 2 at some point, because that sort of stuff was just super powerful for some reason. It was just super. It was really weird. It's a really weird time, actually. Book of Moon, this card wasn't at 1 yet, I don't think. No, it was at 1, actually, and people were still playing it. People considered the best neg 1 in the entire game, and rightfully so. It really was. This card was limited during a time when Gravekeepers was super prominent, and actually this was a really big hit to them. I don't think Royal Tribute is on this list yet, but it would be at some point. But Book of Moon Gravekeepers was a reason why this card went to 1 at some point. It was just super good removal at the time. Torrential Tribute was also at 1. Now it's just seen as an obscure trap trick, or not trap tricks, obscure trap trick target, as well as a good target in our good trap card in Altergeist to play. But this card was also really feared. You would walk into this and it would be detrimental. Actually, you would actually lose the game because you walked into Torrential Tribute. Trap Dustute is another really good card here, actually. I think this card is actually better now than it was before, because people would really just activate this card to get 1 card out of your hand, and that was fine. It just shuffled it back. And it specifically targeted monsters, and in tandem with Mind Crush, I think actually with Mind Crush would probably be a little bit more broken now too. You would just discard another card or get rid of another card in their hand, possibly more if they had multiple copies, if they were just sitting on them. But Trap Dustute is currently banned on the list right now, but this card was at 1 at some point, and it was actually pretty obnoxious. One called the Haunted. many of you probably are like, huh? This card's really weird. Call of the Hunted is a really fantastic. It used to be a really fantastic trap card for removal. Monster Reborn, I believe, was on this list, but for some reason, I think Billy Break might not have just chosen this for whatever reason. But Call of the Hunted is just really good in general. I think it went to 2 on this list as it stands. Yeah, it was limited at one point, so that's another thing. That's really kind of crazy. Solemn Judgment and Solemn Warning. This was probably the premium package. Solemn Warning was still at 3, and then Solemn Judgment was still at 1 before it got banned shortly after the Agent Structure deck was released, and then it came back at 3 and no one plays it either. So it's just really good. Kind of interesting to throw back here. Next, we have the extra deck. I'm not going to take too much time on this, but I will explain some cards as to why they're super good. I already explained why Bronic is super busted back in the day. Just being able to discard your hand to return any card that you wanted on the board was super good. It returned your own so you could recycle your cards, which was super good. That was really amazing, actually. We got the Levier. This was kind of a niche tech, actually. There wasn't really that much banishing going on except through BLS and the Kaius. And actually, old school Yu-Gi-Oh! This used to target level 4 or lower banished monsters. It didn't. It was ruled that it wouldn't target your own. It would target any of them in either player's banish zone. So that's the thing. Leviathan Dragon. It was just super good. Just a good beat stick. Steelstorm Roach. Just being able to take care of your opponent's inherent summons. I know that's not necessarily a term that judges like to use, but that's what I'm going to use to simplify this. An inherent summon is basically a card that summons itself without the aid of another card effect. And this card was really good for dealing with your opponent's really big synchro monsters. It was just nice. Utopia, just a really good rank 4 at the time. Formula Synchron, used to draw cards. It's still played to this day, actually, now. Kind of funny how that works out. Armory Arm. This was kind of a union monster. So what it would do is you would equip it to a monster, and then it would gain 1,000 attack. And if it destroyed a monster and sent it to the graveyard, you would just inflict battle damage equal to that card's attack. It was pretty good. It was a good way to do a lot of damage. Allied Justice Cataster was a good card to remove things. CJ Hyper Librarian, another good card to draw cards with. Orient Dragon, a niche tech card that destroyed other people's synchro monsters and then banished them. Actually, didn't destroy him, it just banished him. So, Ancient Fairy Dragon, just an extender. Really, that's all there is to it. Being able to summon a level 4 monster at any point, even if you can't connect your battle phase, was really good back then. Black Rose, I believe, was at 1, I think. No, it was not at 1. It was at 3 copies per deck. But I do remember this card being limited. And being able to blow up your opponent's board with this was really good. Stardust Dragon was really good for negating your opponent's Dark Holes and Black Rose Dragons and Torrential Tributes. Scrap Dragon was just good removal. And Trishula. Trishula is still at 1 today. And Trishula was at 3 at some point, and that was a terrible mistake. Because Trishula loops were insane. And Trishula loops will always be insane. Next, we're going to move on to the side deck. Not really too much to say about the side deck. It's kind of interesting, actually, to see some of this stuff be used, and it's a little bit nostalgic for me. Cyber Dragons. The reason why you would play Cyber Dragons is because of Cybertech Fortress, Chimera Tech Fortress Dragon, which you would special summon your Cyber Dragon, and if your opponent was playing like Machina, which I think was Machina Girgia, which was actually a popular deck at the time, you would just absorb their stuff, and then you would summon this card, and it would be really good. So it was pretty good. Yeah. 2DD Crow. Graveyard manipulation was always a big thing. So, Leeching the Light. Now, this was actually the spicy tech that Billy Break decided to play. You select one face-up light monster your opponent controls. All face-up attack position your monsters you control gain attack equal to the attack of that selected monster until the end of the turn. So, if your opponent was playing BLS, this was a good counter to that. You would activate this. That wasn't really the main target for it. Well, I mean, it was a primary target for it, but that wasn't like the end-all be-all target. You were happy with like Thunder King Ryo and stuff like that. But you would target your opponent's light monster, and you would just gain the attack. It was super fantastic. It was really good. The third copy of MST. Yeah, Mystical Space MST was actually semi-limited and then went to 3 on this list. Actually, it's kind of funny. Megamorph on this list was actually at 3 too. It went to 2 as well. That's kind of crazy, actually. Anyway, moving on. 2 Bottomless. Super good card. Well, I mean, it was a super good card. That was actually kind of meh. This card was actually feared. This card was at 2 for the longest time, and they put it to 1, and then now it's at 3, and no one plays it. Change of Appearance. This card was really good for getting rid of monsters that your opponent had extras of. If your opponent was playing, well, people are playing Tour Guide a lot, so he would activate this on their first Tour Guide, and they wouldn't be able to activate Tour Guide anymore. So it was pretty good. Dust Tornado, another spell drop removal card. Mind Crush. I have the X here because this is the old version of it and not the new way that we have it now. You would just be able to look at your opponent's hand and then discard anything. So even if they didn't have the card, you would still verify that they had the card for information. And it was really kind of sacky, actually. And the Debunk, which if it's good against sand traps, actually. This was a pretty good Call by the Grave. This was Call by the Grave before Call by the Grave existed, but it was really slow, but it worked and people liked it. So yeah, overall I think the deck is the deck is obviously very good. It's solidified itself in history as a top contender, and the interesting thing about this deck is that it really wasn't meant to win, because like I said, the plant package just got limited. A lot of the cards just went to 1, and a lot of the good synchros that were relevant for that package also went to 1, which was pretty crazy. So I hope you guys did enjoy this dive back into Yu-Gi-Oh history, and I hope you guys subscribe for more of this, because I do plan on making more of these, because they're kind of fun to make, and they're really interesting to me, at least, and it kind of gives some people some eyes on what the old formats used to look like. People talk about Go Control a lot, but people don't talk about the decks in between Go Control and now, and I kind of want to talk about those. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please leave a comment in the comment section down below. I'll see you guys in the next video. This has been All Things Entertaining, signing off.